What would happen if Nicolás Maduro's regime collapsed? Well, it's a question that a lot of people have been asking, and it turns out we might already have an answer. A previously conducted secret U.S. wargame modeled Maduro's collapse, and the results weren't pretty. Chaos, fragmentation, and a power vacuum that Washington may not be ready for. I'll have those details. We've been watching the rising tensions, of course, between Washington and Caracas, and the steady U.S. military buildup in the region. But it all raises a basic question, of course. What would actually happen if the U.S. toppled Nicolás Maduro? Well, there's a detail tucked into a recent New York Times piece that deserves a lot more attention than it's getting, because it actually seems to answer that question. During President Trump's first term, U.S. officials quietly ran a war game exploring what might happen if Maduro were pushed out of power in Venezuela. And the result wasn't some triumphant march toward democracy. It was chaos, prolonged, grinding, unpredictable chaos. According to people familiar with the exercise, analysts walked through different scenarios: a military coup, a popular uprising, a negotiated exit, and every path appeared to lead to the same messy destination. The collapse of the Maduro regime didn't produce a clean handoff to opposition leaders or technocrats waiting in the wings. Instead, the country splintered. Cartels rushed to carve out territory. Colombian guerrilla groups moved in. Parts of the Venezuelan military broke off and started answering to whatever local boss could pay them. The oil fields, the heart of Venezuela's economy, became contested ground. And the central government, such as it was in this war game, couldn't stitch anything back together. It's worth pausing there because that's not the picture that U.S. politicians usually paint when they talk about Venezuela. The public script so far focuses on restoring democracy, helping the Venezuelan people, or ending narco-terrorism. But this particular war game tells us something else. Even if Maduro falls, the U.S. may not like what comes next. This is where the present moment becomes even more interesting. The U.S. is applying the most aggressive pressure on Venezuela in years. Military deployments in the Caribbean, talk of designating Maduro's circle as a terrorist organization, new intelligence leaks about cartel ties, and diplomatic messages that sound a lot like ultimatums. Meanwhile, Maduro's government is warning that he'll employ his militias, what they're calling people's armies, asymmetric warfare, the language of a regime that is preparing for a siege. And in the middle of all that, well, the Times reminds us we've already gamed out what happens if the whole thing collapses. What the war game suggests is that Washington shouldn't assume a post-Maduro Venezuela looks anything like a stable state. It may look more like a vacuum, one that criminal groups and foreign actors and local warlords would be rushing to fill. That's another point that the Times hints at. The war game wasn't just about internal Venezuelan dynamics. It included Russia, China, Iran, players with interests in Caracas who wouldn't sit quietly by if the U.S. reshaped the map. Moscow has, of course, sold weapons to the regime and values the relationship with a country in America's backyard. Tehran has backed Maduro's intelligence services. And Beijing, well, they've got billions tied up in loans and infrastructure. The message from the old war game was simple. If Venezuela collapses, you don't just get Venezuela. You get a host of other interested players. All of this lands at a moment when the Trump administration is weighing options that could push the crisis toward a breaking point. And it raises a pretty important question. Is the U.S. actually prepared for the fallout that it's already predicted? So when you hear big statements about tough action or promises that a new government in Caracas would immediately stabilize, keep that war game in the back of your mind. The people who ran it weren't guessing. They were using the best intelligence available at the time, and this was President Trump's first term, and what they saw wasn't a victory parade. All right, coming up next, we'll take you inside President Trump's 28-point peace plan to end the war in Ukraine and the White House's aggressive diplomatic push to get Kyiv on board by Thanksgiving. Oh, look, turkey's done. I'll be right back. Hey, Mike Baker here with big news from our friends over at the Birch Gold Group. It's now that one time of year that Birch Gold Group gives away free gold with every qualifying purchase. That's right. For Black Friday, when you convert an existing IRA or a 401k into a tax-sheltered IRA in gold, Birch Gold will send free gold to your home for every $20,000 purchased. Look, gold started this year around, $2,600 an ounce? And by October, it was over $4,000 an ounce. And you ask yourself why? Well, primarily because of global uncertainty. 2025 was defined by trade wars and real wars and general unease. And central banks are pulling away from the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency. So, as you may know, gold thrives in times of uncertainty. If you're looking to diversify your savings, Birch Gold can help you. Plus, now through November 30th, you get free gold with a qualifying purchase. Just text PDB to 989-898 to claim your eligibility and for a free information kit on gold. But your opportunity for free gold with qualifying purchase ends on November 30th. So don't wait. Text PDB to the number 989-898 for all the details. Welcome back to the Afternoon Bulletin. I want to provide an update on the highly controversial U.S. peace plan being promoted by the White House to end the war in Ukraine, as pressure mounts on Ukrainian President Zelensky to accept the Trump administration's tentative framework, despite the protests of European allies and the deep skepticism of Kyiv. On Thursday, President Trump privately urged Ukraine to accept the outline of a new 28-point peace framework by Thanksgiving, according to U.S. officials who spoke with multiple outlets. The president publicly reinforced that timeline on Friday, calling it, quote, appropriate, and warning that Ukraine could, quote, lose in a short period of time if talks stall. If this sounds like a reversal from the very recent tough talk coming out of the White House regarding the new sanctions on Russian oil giants Rosneft and Lukoil, well, that's because it is. The diplomatic clock is now ticking for Kyiv, and the stakes, frankly, couldn't be higher. As we discussed on yesterday's PDB, the U.S. drafted plan would require Ukraine to make sweeping concessions that track closely with the Kremlin's long-standing demands. Now, I want to stress that behind the scenes, U.S. officials confirmed to NBC News that the Thanksgiving target is more of a goal than an ultimatum. But the message was unmistakable. The Trump administration wants Kyiv to sign off on the framework quickly before winter sets in on the battlefields. And the consequences for pushing back could be crippling for Ukraine. Multiple anonymous sources told Reuters Friday that the Trump administration is threatening to cut intelligence sharing and weapons supplies for Ukraine if leaders in Kyiv don't get on board. Trump's message landed just hours after Zelensky delivered one of his starkest addresses of the war, telling Ukrainians they were facing a choice between their, quote, dignity and the risk of losing a key partner. Zelensky said, quote, this is one of the most difficult moments in our history. The pressure on Ukraine is one of the hardest. He urged Ukrainians to stay united ahead of what he said will be, quote, a very difficult, eventful week. Publicly, Zelensky is attempting to walk a very fine diplomatic line, likely in an attempt to avoid offending President Trump. After receiving a draft of the proposal on Thursday and meeting with U.S. Army Secretary Daniel Driscoll in Kyiv, Zelensky said, quote, we are ready for constructive, honest, and prompt work. On Friday, he added in a post on X that he had spoken for nearly an hour with Vice President J.D. Vance and Driscoll about the framework, saying Ukraine has always respected Trump's desire to put an end to the bloodshed. It was a delicate message that signaled Kyiv as not rejecting the U.S. plan outright, but is not on board with key aspects of the proposal. As the news broke, Zelensky also held an emergency call with the leaders of Germany and Britain and France. As we discussed yesterday, European allies were not consulted on the proposal and have not been shy about voicing their grave concerns, fearing President Trump is playing directly into the Kremlin's hands. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas warned Friday that, quote, this is a very dangerous moment for all. During the call, Zelensky reportedly assured his European allies that while he valued Trump's efforts, he would work to ensure a, quote, dignified peace that takes into account Kyiv's principled stances. The flurry of remarks on Friday come as the finer details of the plan began leaking to the press. Under the 28-point plan, Kyiv would be required to give up the entire Donbas region, including areas still under Ukrainian control. They would also need to cede Crimea to Russia, and meanwhile the framework would freeze the front line in the southeastern Kherson and Zaporizhia regions and create a demilitarized zone between the current front line and the border of Donetsk. Furthermore, Ukraine would be barred from ever joining the NATO alliance and would be required to cap their army size at 600,000 troops. The U.S. supposedly would provide security guarantees to Ukraine, though details remain very vague or undefined, And Ukraine, Europe, and Russia would then enter into a, quote, non-aggression agreement. As part of this proposal, Trump also wants NATO to agree to not expand their boundaries any further or station troops in Ukraine. Finally, Reuters reports that sanctions would be slowly lifted off of Russia in a phased approach, and Russia would be invited to rejoin the G8 and be reintegrated into the global economy, and the U.S. would then enter into a sweeping economic agreement with Moscow, and Putin would get a pony. Now, you'd think Moscow would be fawning over the agreement, and they probably are, privately, but so far, publicly, the Kremlin is taking a cautious approach. A Kremlin spokesman said they have not received any framework and no substantive discussions have been had, despite reports that Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev played a role in crafting the plan, I bet he did, with U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. Still, the Kremlin taunted Kyiv, encouraging Zelensky to negotiate before it's too late. And Putin later suggested that he favors the framework. Of course he does. It basically matches his long-standing demands. To state the obvious, Europe is in a state of alarm over the proposal and the speed at which the White House is pushing it. They fear the concessions will embolden Russia, fracture the Ukrainian government, and leave them holding the security burden for a weakened Ukraine, all while Putin gets to claim victory. Because, well, yeah, it would be a victory. And that, my friends, is the PDB Afternoon Bulletin for Friday, the 21st of November. Now, if you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at pdb@thefirsttv.com. And, of course, to listen to the show ad-free, just become a premium member of the President's Daily Brief by visiting pdbpremium.com. And don't forget, it's Friday. Of course, you knew that. Which means another episode of our extended weekend show, the PDB Situation Report, hits the airwaves this evening at 10 p.m. on the First TV. Excellent guests, insightful conversations. Really, the only thing missing would be a house band and, I suppose, a jolly sidekick announcer. You can also catch it on our YouTube channel. That's at President's Daily Brief, and wherever you get your podcast stuff. I'm Mike Baker, and I'll be back over the weekend with the PDB Situation Report. Until then, stay informed, stay safe, stay cool. Hey, Mike Baker here with a message from our pals over at Ridge Wallets. Now, before I switched to using a Ridge wallet, I was carrying around one of those giant leather bricks for a wallet. You know what I'm talking about. Bulky, falling apart, and honestly, it hurt my back just sitting on it all day. Now, switching to Ridge was a game changer. And now, Ridge just made their best wallet even better with Ridge 2.0. It's slimmer, it's 10% lighter, and it even includes AirTag attachments. Made from premium materials like aluminum, titanium, and carbon fiber, it holds up to 12 cards and cash, in case you're still carrying cash around. With over 50 styles to choose from, it's perfect for holiday gifting. And you may have noticed the gifting is coming up, right? Holidays are right around the corner, so maybe get ready. For a limited time, Ridge is having their huge Black Friday sale. Head on over to ridge.com, that's R-I-D-G-E, ridge.com, to get up to 47% off your order. 47%. This is by far the biggest discount they've given all year. That's ridge.com for up to 47% off your order during their biggest sale of the year. And after you purchase, they'll ask where you heard about them. Do me a favor. Tell them the PDB sent you.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment, a really positive, nice, and kind comment. That would be appreciated. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our daily updates.